Hello there, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. The Galactic Empire is often viewed as a militaristic government defined by its massive superweapons programs and awe-inspiring fleet formations. But on this channel, we like to take a look beneath the hood of this galaxy-wide dictatorship and understand the individual systems that kept this impressive display of force going. And I gotta say, after you understand the economy the Empire inherited from the Republic, you understand why the Empire never really stood a chance at all. But first, I want to take a second to talk about a YouTube channel called AFK. I really want to do a shout out for these guys because they make amazing content. It's just simply that. I first found out about AFK because of their series For the Empire. It is an absolutely hilarious series of shorts that follows a few stormtroopers as they're going about their lives in the Empire. It's very relatable if you've ever served in the Corps yourself. It's also really high quality stuff. The animation and voiceover work is top notch, and the writing is funny, and it's clearly done by fans who have talent and a lot of passion for Star Wars. We'll link them in the description below so you can check it out, or in one of the comments. If I don't remember to do that, just comment and be like, hey Alan, you forgot. The other reason why I really want to talk about this channel is there's different levels of effort being put into videos on YouTube. That's just how the world works. And channels like mine, I do put a lot of work in the scripts, but it's a lot less work than a person who actually sits down, writes an actual story, animates it, hires people to do all the, the voice acting, and then edit it together, color correct. I don't know, they're using Unreal Engine. So I don't even know how that stuff works, but it's a lot of work. And channels like AFK, they don't do as well because of the algorithm, because they can't make as much quantity. And this is probably why this channel only has 287,000 subscribers. But all of their videos, you can binge watch them. They're amazing. And so please guys, if you are a Star Wars fan, this is right up your alley. You should definitely check these guys out. Highly recommend. If you attempt to look at the Galactic Empire as a rational economist, who assumes that the political leadership is just interested in stable, sustainable growth, improving the lives of all the citizens in the galaxy, then you will be in for a nasty surprise. Because that's not what the Empire is about. What Palpatine was really after was complete total domination and power at levels that are just, frankly, unheard of. Palpatine wanted to rule without any checks or balances, without anyone ever questioning his decisions. And he's also completely obsessed with ascension and becoming immortal. This man wanted to rule the galaxy like a living god. The Empire was just a stepping stone for him, really. And this became obvious to me the second he decided to scrap the entire Galactic Republic Navy, along with the Grand Army of the Republic. Now granted, the Navy and the Clone Army were designed for high-intensity conventional battlefields, and when the Separatists defeated, the need for such an elite fighting force diminished greatly. But the initial cost for training the clones, the initial cost of resources for building all of the naval ships had been paid off already. The Republic Navy's fleet was mostly full of capital ships that were no more than 4 to 5 years of age, and a good portion of them were brand new and never saw any combat. The clones, even with their advanced aging, were still young enough to serve. If anything, their experience, combined with the wisdom of age, made them excellent peacekeepers. There are many cost-saving measures the Empire could have taken, not changing out the Grand Army of the Republic, not changing out the Republic Navy for entirely new ships, and maybe, working in new models gradually as the years went on, maybe after several decades of service. The majority of the galaxy's resources should not have been devoted to building ships, but actually rebuilding cities and industries, where every credit spent grows local economies and creates value for people. Of course, Palpatine doesn't see value in people, he just sees everyone as an asset or some kind of commodity that he can use for his own end goal. If you lived on one of the great foundry worlds of the Empire during this time period, you would have sensed that something great was happening. The galaxy is large. The resources pooled at the galactic level can be tremendous, and to see city-sized ships being cranked out on a daily basis on the rings of Quat or over Cornet City has to be awe-inspiring. And the best part about this was you can be a part of it. They needed more manpower. There were plenty of new jobs in the shipbuilding industry for all sorts of people who are interested. And it wasn't just the building the ships that employed people. You could also mine resources, you could process them, refine them into a workable material. You can work in transportation, logistics. You could also work in research and development as well. There are also jobs for building all of the new infrastructure in the galaxy, and also service jobs that also grow up around those industries to serve the actual workers. A lot of people actually believed that the galaxy was going through a period of great economic growth and prosperity. Unfortunately, all of this growth was being paid by a heavily indebted government that was already maxing out its credit cards. The Galactic Empire, in its first few years, was just the Galactic Republic with some gray paint on it. That means the Galactic Empire also shared the Galactic Republic's massive amount of debt that it had collected throughout the Clone Wars. And yes, Palpatine did take over the main lender to the Republic, the intergalactic banking clans, but that doesn't really fix the problem. You know, dictators really love pushing things. They love going against the rules. They like to manipulate the truth. They like to control the media. They like to change the culture. But there's one thing you really can't control, which is value. You can't just create value by faking it. You actually have to put the work in. You could print a lot of money, or you could steal a lot of money, but in the long run, again, that won't create value. Taking over the intergalactic banking clan might seem like a desirable move at the time from a power point of view. It's clear Palpatine wanted to establish his own Federal Reserve so he could set interest rates and even print currency as needed, but the IGBC was actually in horrible shape. You remember, the Sith had convinced the banking system to fund both sides of the conflict, and because of the nature of war, that means one half of their capital will disappear when one side loses the war. And that's basically what happens. Now, usually banks would never take this kind of risk, or they would make their loans so expensive that even if one side fails, you're getting enough interest payment income to cover your losses. In this case, neither of these things happened. Actually, the IGBC gave the Separatists special rates. They gave Dooku much lower rates so that they could essentially borrow more money to create this massive military. Remember, the Separatists were much smaller than the Republic, and so as a result, when the Confederacy independence systems collapsed, not only did all of those loans not get repaid, the banks didn't even collect that much interest premium at all. So it was a lose-lose for them. The result is the Empire has absorbed a banking system that is completely toxic and dysfunctional with tons of losses and liabilities. That's kind of what happened during the 2008 Great Recession. You had a lot of these investment banks that were just holding on to just dog quality investment products, and they needed to be bailed out. Otherwise, they were going to go under. Luckily, you had larger banks like Bank of America and Chase who were able to absorb failed institutions like Merrill Lynch and Bear Stearns. Now, I know a lot of people are really angry that the banks got bailed out because we all suffered, right? Like, my mom lost her job. It was rough. But the truth is, if we hadn't bailed out those banks, if we hadn't provided some way to take over those accounts, right, it could have caused even more problems, like really huge problems. See, modern day economy is just heavily leveraged. Like, everyone is borrowing money to pay employees, to fund new projects, to open that fifth restaurant, whatever, or to buy a house. When you have a heavily leveraged economy, you need someone to provide liquidity for the market. You need money makers. You need just people to make sure that the transfer of cash flows quickly. And when you have several large banks failing, that's what puts a stop to all economic activity. And very soon after that, you get a domino effect that can lead to horrible things. So the problems the Empire faced were actually a lot bigger than what we faced during the 2008 financial crisis. That crisis was caused by the subprime mortgage market collapsing. It's a relatively small fraction of the larger market. The problem was you had a lot of investment banks heavily leveraged and putting a lot of money into these products. I mean, like Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, they were probably, for every $20 or $30 they're investing, only $1 was theirs. Everything else was borrowed. So obviously when the subprime mortgage market collapsed, because they're just made out of really mortgages and not AAA ones, everything went tits up. And you had this cascading effect where people were really worried that major banks could fail too, which of course meant that people can get paid. A lot of things in our economic system are being paid by borrowed money, essentially. But anyway, there were some larger banks, as we mentioned, who were willing to do their patriotic duty to take on these very toxic banks and all of their accounts. Plus, the central government was able to deploy a lot of cash. The Empire doesn't really have the ability to do this because, one, the central government was bankrupt. And two, the IGBC was already the largest banking system in the galaxy. There's really no way for the smaller banking systems to absorb it. So in this situation, instead of Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers collapsing, we're talking about Bank of America, Citigroup, Chase, all the big banks collapsing. That's a problem you can't really solve. You're just going to be screwed in that point. And so Palpatine starts out the Imperial era with this huge problem. And instead of tackling it through austerity and spending cuts, Palpatine did the opposite. He tried to print even more credits. He tried to further expand the galactic economy by building up the military-industrial complex, and of course that just leads to him printing more credits and a lot of inflation. So at first, Palpatine had to pay people. He had to pay them handsomely in order to convince them to leave other industries and retrain and join the military-industrial complex. There wasn't exactly a labor force that was ready to go. Remember, most of the galaxy had been at war. There were a lot of displaced people looking for work, but they weren't really trained or in the position to really take care of themselves. A lot of people were just living as refugees. It was very difficult. Now, when you carry out a huge military contract like this, but you don't have enough skilled labor, you're going to run into some problems. For instance, we have the AUKUS nuclear submarine program here in the United States. It's a joint project we're doing with the British to sell Virginia-class nuclear submarines to the Australians, who I now begrudgingly admit are real and not just employees of NASA. Unfortunately, the program is running way behind schedule, like most military contracts do, but the specific problem here is there just aren't enough welders in the United States and also in Australia, where I believe some of these submarines are being built. And so what you have is actually a rapid training program that is turning Lyft drivers, Amazon workers, OnlyFans divas into welders. The pay is good, and they train you on site. I think this is a great thing to do. You increase your overall labor supply, a skilled labor supply in those fields, and potentially you're retraining people in other professions that are either unpaid or just unhappy with what they're doing. But the problem is, in the Empire, this was just a temporary thing. Let's throw money at these people, trick them into working in our senior fleet factory. Meanwhile, their old jobs and old industries are completely falling apart because literally everyone is working inside of the military-industrial complex. And so this kind of reminds me more of that crazy situation that was happening in like the 2010s when there was just a lot of cheap money, a lot of VC money flying around everywhere. So you had all of these crazy kind of apps, direct-to-consumer businesses that were just, they're wasting money, in my opinion. Uber and Lyft, for instance, were notorious for just throwing capital at certain markets in an attempt to squeeze each other out, and also squeeze out international competitors. I remember being in India at the time and really appreciating the fact that I could call an Uber. I mean, like, the local transportation is not for beginners. But yeah, I remember talking to this guy, and he had gone from selling, like snacks on the street, which made him about $300 US a month, to about $1,000 a month driving Uber, which put him solidly in the middle class. He was able to send his kid to a better school. It really uplifted him. But unfortunately, the money from Uber eventually dried up, and the inflated fares went away, and a lot of these drivers went back to working as street vendors. What the Empire did is kind of a mix of these two. It retrained people to do these new jobs, and then it kind of created conditions that forced them to be stuck there. Not a great thing to do. The Empire also became more proactive in, unofficially recruiting more workers for its military-industrial complex as the war got worse. Like on Lothal, farmers' land was confiscated for mining operations, and then these farmers were given temporary shelter in newly built Tarkin towns that sprung up all across the galaxy. And of course, these settlements were usually flooded by recruits from Senior Fleet Systems who wanted skilled laborers for their TIE Defender lines on Lothal. Spending money on defense does not have the same effect on growth as spending money on infrastructure or social services. Now, obviously, if you don't have a good defense and an invader comes and takes over your entire country, then you have no economy. So having no defense is out of the question here. And military spending does create some value and jobs in the short term. But because the products themselves don't really create economic value unless they are protecting factories or being used to transport goods, that means their ability to help the economy is quite limited. Now, obviously, you can export military products to other countries, and that will increase the amount of wealth you generate in your borders. But because the Empire is essentially controlling the entire galaxy and has strict arms controls, they weren't doing that. Now, if the Empire was expanding to hostile areas of the Outer Rim and pacifying said regions while simultaneously bringing in new pioneers to settle the areas, that would be a great investment. That would be the military providing growth for, the Empire. But no, they weren't doing that either. Their military was mostly being used to crack down on distance, which means the Imperial military is more likely to create economic problems when it arrived in an area rather than benefit the local community. Now, the biggest threat that the Empire actually faced at the time was hyperinflation, right? The printing of all of these credits for all of these expensive ships and just no ability to really pay for it all. So the only way you can really do is to devalue your credits, print more. In some ways, you could argue that Emperor Palpatine took the only route that was really available to him. You see, because the Empire consolidated into a command economy, Palpatine actually had complete control over most of the resources being produced in the galaxy. It's kind of like the command economy that the Soviet Union had for a period of time. People didn't produce goods because it benefited them or because they wanted to make some money. They produced goods when the central government told them to do so. So if you have hyperinflation and you're running out of money, or the value of your money has disappeared, one way you can keep at least your soldiers and workers happy is by paying them in rations and fuel and other commodities that you can control. This makes for a good temporary solution. It keeps people from going hungry and being too angry, especially if the people not working for the Empire don't get anything, right? So you have that dynamic. But the long-term problem with not paying people with money but with food is that money is no longer valuable, and so you have very inefficient ways of transferring wealth from one person to another. It's basically a barter system at that point. If there's no liquidity, if there's no way to, raise large amounts of money, then you really can't focus on doing bigger projects. Palpatine essentially killed the galactic economy by doing this, and I think he did this all on purpose. All of his moves to seize power were paired by efforts to make the individual less powerful. He gave the people jobs so that they depended on him for employment, and now he gives them food and energy so that they need him to stay alive and warm. What Palpatine was really trying to do was destroy everything in the galaxy that was worth something, that created value and joy for the average person. This is a really dumb plan, because even the most powerful Sith Lord, despotic, totalitarian dictator still has to sign a social contract with the people. Like, he has to provide for them, he has to take care of them, and if he doesn't do a good job, they will throw him out of office. Which is what happens anyway. If you don't manage the galaxy well, if people start needlessly suffering, if people are no longer being paid fair wages or even being paid at all, then they're going to revolt. And as the Galactic Civil War became more and more intense and the Empire lost more and more soldiers and resources, it soon became apparent that the Imperial Logistical network was quite fragile, and its shipyards were incapable of ramping up more production to where it needed to be. There were also more protests at factories, more dissidents. You also had terror attacks against Imperial facilities and industrial plants, making everything more chaotic. And ultimately, the situation got so bad that the Empire just started relying on slaves to produce goods for their economy, or they just started arresting people left and right and forcing them to work in prison labor camps. We talked about what happens when you get rid of currency and you start a barter kind of system. It's very hard to go back from that. And when you go from paid workers to slavery, that's another line. When you cross, not only is it morally extremely wrong, it will also destroy your economy in the long run, because slavery is just about the most destructive thing you could do to your economy. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. My name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. I'll see you next time.